Welcome to Occupations, the podcast, where we discuss what it's like to hold specific jobs. Occupations is brought to you by lotsofmaps.com, where you fulfill your vintage map gifting needs. Visit lotsofmaps.com.
Hello and welcome to Occupations, the podcast. As usual, I have a great guest for you today, but this one's a little special. We're going to have a little bit of a performance later on, and this one should perk your ears up. I have with me Regie Gibson, and he is an assistant professor of poetry and performance at both Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Berklee College of Music in Boston. And he is also the first and only Poet Laureate of Massachusetts. And I want to welcome him right now. Hi, Regie. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being here. Reggie's going to tell us a little bit about himself, maybe a lot of bit about himself, and how he got to where he is at. And maybe later we're going to try to coerce him to give us an example of what he does.
I can twist my arm.
All right. Arms ready to be twisted. Let's just start with a basic understanding. We know professor of poetry and performance, and we can go deeper into that. But tell me exactly, what is a poet laureate?
A poet laureate is a state-appointed poet, usually by the governor or some political official. And the responsibilities are to go around the Commonwealth, let's just say in this case, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and to promote poetry and language and literature and the literary arts. To also promote that to be a civic good, and to create workshops and work with schools and work with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to better their literary and ELA curriculums.
Very good. Excellent description. Let's go back to little teeny Regie.
Sure.
Where were you born, Regie?
I was born in Mississippi.
Mississippi.
Small town called Chula. Tchula. It's an old Indian name. And my family was there since, I guess you could say, since they were brought there. And we traced our lineage back to approximately 1720, 1750. So previous to that, that's as far back as we could trace. And we moved to Chicago in about 1968 and got there just in time for the cities to be burning down.
Yeah.
Because it was so much unrest, my parents left me with my grandparents so that they could come north and establish a place for me to be. So they stayed with their cousins. And once things got to a space of stability, they came back and got me. And I was living in Chicago ever since.
Excellent. Let's talk about Mississippi.
Sure.
How old were you when you left Mississippi?
Between 1 and 2 years of age.
Oh, okay. So very young.
Yeah,
so
very
do you have any memories of Mississippi?
Only from going back 3 or 4 times a year. And,
Got it. Okay.
And those probably start when I'm approximately 5 or 6.
Okay. Great.
So yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Mississippi. Your family spent a couple of hundred years there, it sounds like. Not of their choosing, but I assume made the best of things considering the situation once slavery was ended. Not an easy place to be, the South, the deep South. I know racism is pretty scary down there still to some degree. Certainly better than it once was, but it's never good, right?
Right. I mean, this is the way it is.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't be, but okay. Regie, tell me a little bit about you growing up, knowing that your family's history was one of slavery and anger is probably not even a big enough term. How do you reconcile yourself with it at this point?
Well, as with most things, most African Americans, we have to distinguish from the ADOS, which are the American descendants of slavery, and other African-derived folks who are here, that we have very different histories. There's an early realization that when I was going to school with people of Italian and Irish and Polish and German extraction, that my family had none of those wonderful immigrant tales that they told about the old country and all of this other kind of stuff. And it was very clear to me early on that there was a qualifiedly different thing about African Americans that were different from almost anybody else who had come here. We did not have the immigrant experience, and therefore we did not have the hope in America that they had. Arguably, everyone who was coming here could be said to have been running from something worse than what they were running to. And that is the opposite of what's happening with ADOS, African Americans, because where we were was better than where we came to. And there was no reason to believe things would be better if you're 2.5, 3 months in the hold of a ship. So we become very clear, I think most African Americans, of the distance between what our country professes and what it actually practices. And you learn that lesson quite early. And even then, with that, African Americans have been among some of the most patriotic, loyal, hardworking individuals in this country who have consistently put this country's feet to the moral fire and have actually made this space better for every immigrant who actually came here. And that is the fact of the matter. So there's a pride in that. Therefore, I look at African American culture that is worldwide. And I noticed a pattern, too, that small groups of people tend to create large groups, large cultural impact. We can look at Jewish culture. We can look at Irish culture. We can look at Jamaicans. We can look at African Americans. Very small groups of people tend to create large cultural impact. And there is that sense of pride when I think about the history and what we survived and continue to survive and continue to hope and continue to move forward.
Does your family have any tales of the old country?
None.
So that was really kind of never.
That was very not passed down like directly. But when one goes to study and look at West African cultures, one can see that there are strains and connections between them. For instance, I was in Germany years ago, and I met a gentleman from Ghana, and he invited me to his home, and he wasn't sure that I would like his food. And so I came to his home, and what he served me, he called it different, but what it basically was grits, yams, and black-eyed peas. And I began to laugh. And he thought it was something with the food. I says, nah. I'm like, you guys spice it a little different. You cook it a little different, but this is pretty much comfort food for me. So we had a good laugh about that. And he's, of course, from West Africa, and yams was brought over by West Africans. I think black-eyed peas as well. You see those cultural moments. You hear something that sounds akin to the blues when you hear certain Africans singing, and you hear other things that the way my grandparents, and especially my grandmother, who I'm thinking about right now, sounded when she was in praise in church. You hear that sometimes in the callings of people from West Africa, and it is chilling what has been preserved. What has been preserved. And so there's no talking about the old country because we don't know which one that was. There was an extraction that was pulled from Africa from multiple places. And so we don't really know what that is.
Right.
Even what a lot of African Americans will understand when I say this, even our last names are not African. Right. Gibson, as 23andMe tells me, is of English, Irish, Scottish extraction. Probably most likely came into my bloodline in the 18th century. And as most African Americans are aware of, it was not invited. Okay. There was no, young woman who decided she wanted to date a Mr. Gibson at some point, and they had a romance and therefore unproduced. So we carry that with us. We understand that's part of what our history is. Hey, we move forward still.
So let's move on to Chicago. So
Alrighty.
You're 1 or 2 years old. You're on your way to Chicago. What was the reasoning that your family did leave? Was it just time to get out of that situation and try to find a better life?
I think yes. And it was part of what was called the Black migration that was coming up from the South. My family was part of that last wave of this great Black migration. So there was a sense of hope because the civil rights struggle was happening. There were jobs which were opening up north. There were cousins and aunts who had already moved up and who had established themselves in certain, had jobs and were able to start buying homes. And so my mom and dad, they were young, and they decided it's time to leave. They couldn't deal with the picking of cotton anymore and got out. My mother had picked cotton since she was 5 or 6 years old. And, that was just what she would do before going off to school because the family needed extra money. And so at least you had steady wages in a factory if you could go up north, and things were much more stable.
Right.
in the compared to the South. So yeah, they did what immigrants do. They look around and say, I can die here, or I can get the hell up out of here and go find a better life somewhere. And for my family, it was Chicago.
Good for them. That's excellent. And good for you in the end as well.
In the end, I would say so, yeah.
All right. So they get to Chicago. I'm going to ask you, do you know the success that they had? I know you were 1 or 2 years old, but was it a struggle right from the get-go?
Well, they had a bit of an advantage only to the degree. So my family was not rich by any means at all, somewhat middle class. But because they had cousins who had gone before them, right? And they knew they could find jobs.
Yeah.
And so what that meant was they had a place to stay that was warm, inviting, and with family. And they also had a way to earn money, right? Which are some things that many immigrants might not have. So they did have that advantage. People they could trust, people they knew, a place to stay, and a way to earn a wage. So that was lucky in that sense, or fortunate. That was a road to success. And there were things that they did not have to struggle with because there were things which family had already provided.
Chicago was a city that was, like you said, on fire. How did your parents deal with that? Were they active in the fight for rights? Or?
My father was. I think he was more active, than my mom was. But yes, my dad was, and he was really about the vote and ensuring voting and doing work with precincts to make sure that voting was counted and to get people registered. So yes, he was very, very active, and maybe that's where I get that sense of civic, engagement from. It's from him.
Were your folks well educated?
Not at all. Up to high school.
Okay.
If we're talking about matriculation into school, then we're talking up to high school, right? If we're talking, about how to live in the world and all of that stuff, then there is that level of gnosis of knowledge about how to do things, but no traditional matriculation into anything other than high school. But they did get that, their high school diplomas.
Were they insistent that you get a good education?
Not really. My father was much more so than my mother, but my father had thoughts about my going to college, but he didn't really push that. What they liked was the idea that I wound up going to become an automotive tech, because that stuff to them is useful. The trades were a different story because that's of use. Then you need those skills.
Writing is your thing. Let's just call it that.
Sure.
Did you, at an early age, enjoy writing when you were learning how to write and how to read? And
I did enjoy it, and I do. Even though I'm at that space where, as a friend of mine once said, I don't enjoy writing, I enjoy being done with writing. I enjoy having written. But I would say for me, it was more about being captured by language. And my great-grandfather, Robert Jordan, was illiterate. He could not read nor write, but he would make up songs and verse and poems as a mnemonic device to help him to remember things. And I didn't know, of course, that my great-granddad was illiterate. I didn't know that until I was around 16, because he would tell us these stories and all of this. And my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother were both in the house. My great-granddad was cooking bacon and singing one of his songs. I am working now, all day long, Lord. Here comes the sun, traveling tracks of sky. Oh, Lord. Now, of course, he didn't realize that what he was doing was creating metaphor, that he was creating, a connection between the sun going up in the sky and the light coming down the tunnel. Right, so the sun's going up when he's getting up to go to work, and there's a train coming down the tunnel. Now he talks about the tracks of the skies, right? So he turns the sun into this train, and of course, when you think about that, it's absurd, right? The sun is not this, and the sky is not tracks, but there's a meaning that it has to it. And if I was to go back to him now and say, well, Granddad, what you were using is metaphor, and when you did this analogy between this and that, he'd be like, I was just singing, what I saw.
Would he like that, or would he? I think he'd be like, "Oh, go away."
With him, it's hard to say. He'd probably just throw some food at me or something, or bring out some of his moonshine or whatever. He'd probably just do that and say, "That's interesting, okay."
Yep.
And he would sing that song. What was happening at one particular time? My great grandmother was in the front of the house, and she started singing one of her gospel songs. I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. All along life's pilgrim journey. I want Jesus to walk with me. And my brother and I were both in this room because we were in a house that he built, so the walls were very, very thin. And at this particular time, my great-granddad's secular work song began to meet up with my great-grandmother's love song to God. And the only way I can explain it is it just opened up a space, like the sacred and the profane meeting in that space. And I remember looking at my brother, and he looked at me, and we talked about this. We do talk about this. And all the time I'm like, yeah, that was the time it really changed. That's the moment I knew. That was the moment I knew something. I didn't have words for it yet, but I knew whatever that was, I needed to get to that space. Oh. And my brother goes, yeah, that was great bacon. Of course he was correct. It was excellent bacon.
I bet it was. Well, I guess perception is different for different
I always
folks,
joke about
right?
that, man. It's like, that's why I'm a better poet. He's a better cook. We both took what we needed from that moment,
That's excellent. I love that. That's a great story.
Yeah.
Excellent. How old were you at that time?
I was about 6 or 7.
Okay.
Yep.
So that was a real turning point in your thinking about analogy and writing and
absolutely. And what really brought that out next was my Uncle Larry gave me a dictionary. I still have it. I could show it to you at some point, but it's and it goes with me to almost every school in every country I've gone to.
By the way, for those listening, a dictionary is actually a book.
Yes. And there is no .com after this one. It's an actual book with words in it. In fact, that dictionary is what I got sworn in on.
Wow.
As Poet Laureate, I got sworn in on that dictionary.
Wow.
And my uncle gave it to me. This is what I remember. My Uncle Larry, he was a drug user, and he didn't think he had much to offer, but he somehow sensed a thing with me in language. And he gives me the book, and he goes, "You pretty good with them words and shit. I ain't got no use for this shit. Take this shit." Right? And what my uncle didn't realize is that he was also doing poetry. He was creating a lineation here, right? A parallelism, almost along the lines of I came, I saw, I conquered, right? And what he was doing at the end of that "and shit," right, is he was doing something called an epistrophe, which is the repetition of something at the of a phrase or word at the end of a line, right? Now, it's ancient Greek, but if I'd have went to him and said, Uncle, what you were actually doing was you was doing a parallelism with epistrophe. He'd be like, yeah, whatever, let's go to my granddad's house and get some food. That's probably what he would have said. So the poetry was always there, and it's always there in the language. If we look for it, we pick it up, then we begin to understand that it's always all around us. It's a matter of snatching it and trying to weave it into something that's communicative and beautiful.
Now, obviously, again, big moment for you.
Huge, yeah.
You got yourself a dictionary.
Took me 3 years to read it. Yep.
Yeah. Cover to cover.
Cover to cover.
Did he realize how much that meant to you?
I don't know that he did. He died, some years back, but I think he thought it would have meant more to me and that I could have done more with it than he could based upon what he said. And it was all he had to give me. And I accepted it. At first I was like, okay, there's a book, it doesn't, where do you put the batteries, that kind of thing. But it was a gift that he gave to me that he must have sensed. Like he said, he didn't have any use for it, but he thought I might.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that was a beautiful moment that I didn't realize the beauty of it at that moment, but years later looking back. And the connection that I formed with language as a result of those two moments, my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother doing their thing, and then my uncle giving me this, I think I probably had no choice, but to move into a space of trying to create meaning through these squawks and squeaks that we call words and language.
So, I mean, these are lessons that are passed down from family member to family member. Even if they don't realize that they're doing it, you may not even understand what's being done, but looking back at it, these are gifts of gold, really.
Absolutely.
That's
absolutely.
Terrific.
And another gift of gold came from my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Green, who was Irish-American, lovely man. But he ripped into me like you wouldn't believe. One day I said the word that I tell my children to never say, and that word was, I'm bored. I said, bored. And Mr. Green, I wrote about this. Mr. Green turned around and he just led into me. Well, Mr. Gibson, when you are bored, you are simultaneously boring. And he just started going, off, and he was saying, to be bored is a crime against human intelligence. This world is no circus clown wearing a big nose and funny shoes juggling for petulant children. If you want to know what is happening in this world, you cannot sit on the shore. You must walk toward the waters and get wet. And then he ended it with, and if, Mr. Gibson, you decide to pursue higher education, let's say the 6th grade, you might understand what we do come to understand. And that is the most interesting people you will ever meet are also the most interested. I was basically protoplasm, and he just basically sucked the water out. But at that time, what he gave me was an understanding that being bored was a choice, that nothing in and of itself is boring. It was like if I was not a boring individual, I could find something of interest.
Yeah.
And I think as a result of that, that's why I began to expand into larger and larger pursuits. And it was because of a dressing down by a teacher.
Sure.
And I have often wondered if other students, because we have this idea that we should not, quote unquote, shame students. I wonder what those students are missing if someone can't really say, this is how your shit stinks.
Yeah.
And then have them have that moment of self-reflection,
Right.
And say, I never want to be feeling like that again. And that's what he did for me. When he did that, I began to sit up more in class. I began to look like I was interested. And then I began to study stuff because I didn't want to be called out again. And then finally it led, like I said, to studying more and more and more and more stuff. And it was because I was shamed.
Okay, you were shamed and you don't want to be treated that way again, and I understand that, but were the words that he was saying making sense to you as well? The meaning of what he was saying versus just the shaming?
Yes,
what he was saying
I want to be
sense?
clear. I want to be clear.
Yeah.
Yes, it made sense. I felt shame.
Right.
So I should say that. But that was him saying what he needed to say and not caring if I was shamed by what was going on. So often I see, especially in where I live, the parenting is different than where I've come from. And much of the parenting is you're your kid's friend and you don't really tell them when they're doing something wrong. You try to, and it's like, no, I came from a place where it's like, nope, that's wrong. We do not do that. That is not who we are. Right. And so it wasn't a matter of, would you like to get up and wash the dishes, please? It's like, no, this is your responsibility. Get your ass out of bed and wash these dishes. And that's what I expect to have happen when I come home. So it was like things you weren't given, the benefit of choice where you might even say no.
Right.
This is proscribed. Right. This is what's going to happen. And it's exactly what happened.
But the intentions were good. It's not that he was trying to be mean. He certainly saw it as a learning moment.
I don't know what we used to call him Mr. Mean Jeans and Mr. Mean Green. I don't know whether he felt he was mean or not.
Oh, okay.
I think what he felt was, this is what this moment calls for.
Yeah.
Okay. And mean would be my interpretation of what's happening. And I don't know how many students went, shit, I don't want to say bored in his class again. And I can pretty much tell you, I never said it. And I never saw anybody else get dressed down because somebody else probably never said it either. Because it was really clear, you might as well have called him a curse word. He was not having that word bored. For him, it was pure intellectual laziness. And he was like, no, that's a crime against human intellect.
All right, I'm going to ask you a very serious question. I need you to answer it truthfully.
Sure.
Have you been bored ever since?
I have said this. I have had existential ennui. I have varying levels of interest in stuff, and some things just don't interest me, So I don't deal with something long enough to get bored, I would say.
Just call it something else.
Yeah, you can call it something else, because, right, it's like if you do want to express disinterest in something, then it's one other thing. Now you got to stress for that and to think about why. Right? Is that a matter of you sense no relevance here? Or is that a matter of you not bringing interest to something? And just own that. But the thing in and of itself is neutral. This is boring. No, it's not. Yeah. You're disinterested.
Right.
Why? Don't blame this thing for your lack of interest. Don't blame this thing because you do not wish to intellectually engage. This thing does nothing. That's all on you, pal.
Yep.
Do some self-diagnosis and figure out why this thing that you know nothing about, you're not interested in.
Right, right.
Blame yourself. It's on you.
Wise words,
Yeah.
for sure. Let's talk about your writing at that point.
Sure.
What were you writing? Had you found poetry yet? Or
We're talking 5th or 6th grade?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You had found poetry,
yeah.
and was that what you were?
I wrote poems. I wrote stories. Mostly, I would say poems. And some of the poems, I remember the first poems I wrote were about, like, I don't know, sweeping chimneys and stuff like that. It's because I was watching a lot of stuff based on Charles Dickens. And you know, we had family classics in Chicago. And so we would watch all of this sort of 1930s English stuff. We had no chimney to sweep, but it was, but, you know, it's what I read about. So it's what I wrote about.
Nice.
But yes, I was writing poetry at the time. And I was really thrilled by poems. Maybe it was the 4th grade or something, 5th grade, that my mom, she used to bring home these books that she would get from secondhand places and stuff. And she'd bring home books. And it was one particular time that she brought home some books. And inside of this box was what would become my Bible, was complete works of William Shakespeare. I was in the 5th grade, 6th grade, something like that. Didn't know much about it, didn't read much into it. So I just kind of put it aside. What I was interested in was the science fiction stuff that was in there. And then I discovered one poem. It was a poem in big print by Edgar Allan Poe. It was The Raven. And I started reading it. I'm going through these rhythms, and I'm like, this is incantatory. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. And then it gets to the point, nevermore. And then what happened is this thing. 3 pages were missing.
Oh.
And I'm like, you know, my brain is doing this skip. And so I'm like, I need to find out what happens, right? So my mother takes me to the Legler Library branch, which was just down the street from us. And I walked in and asked the librarian if she had a book of poems. She says, we've got plenty of books of poems. What are you looking for? I couldn't remember the name of it. And she says, well, it's going to be difficult to help you. And then but I could recite it because the rhythm had etched itself into my brain. Yeah. And I didn't get the first line up. Oh, you want The Raven. So she took me, taught me how to use, you know, the Dewey Decimal System. And I was there in the midst of this aisle with Edgar Allan Poe's poetry. And it was another one of those watershed moments, right? And it was fantastic. And I discovered Rudyard Kipling by watching Taxi. You remember that TV show, Taxi? Jim Ignatowski, right? Who was, you know, always sort of burnt out or whatever. Something was happening in the episode, and he wakes out of his slumber, and he begins to do If by Rudyard Kipling. The last part, if you can speak with crowds, walk with kings, and not lose the common touch. And then in the end, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds distance run, yours is the world and all that it's in it. And what is more, you will be a man, my son. And I was like, whoa, right? I was like, what is that poem? And I didn't know what the poem was. And I looked for that poem, but I only had the last part of it. And my librarian didn't know it. And then one day I was just reading some of the poems of Rudyard Kipling and found that poem, If. And there it was. And I was like, wow, you know, I found this piece. I think I ripped it out of I think I ripped it out of the book. And so since then, it was a poem I've also given to my sons to memorize. And finally went back to the Shakespeare when I was about 13. As I like to say, I was the horny 13-year-old and was realizing that I loved women and couldn't get them to love me back. And saw the Romeo and Juliet play, the televised version that was put out in 1968 or 69 by Zeffirelli, starring Olivia Hussey and Leonard Whiting. And it was a fantastic, you know. And so I went to go read the book and saw again what language does, and you know, just heard in the language Romeo, who he sees Juliet, and he's like, oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. So shows this snowy dove trooping amongst crows, as yonder lady over her fellows shows. When the dance is done, I'll watch her place of stance, and touching hers will make blessed my rude hand. Did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight, I've never seen true beauty till this night. He's saying this, but it's like what this roiling thing that's happening inside of him. And then he goes And he grabs her by the hand, and he talks to her, and they begin this pas de deux. And I didn't discover later that they were actually speaking back and forth to each other in a sonnet. It's an actual sonnet that they're doing these exchanges back and forth. And it more ensconced in me, this idea that this roiling, this boiling, this thing that's inside of you, once it takes language, it's poetry, right? Poetry might not be able to tell you exactly what something is, but it can give you a sense of what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
That was a thing that also where I knew. I just knew that it was going to be something that would be with me for the rest of my life.
Wow.
Yeah.
So at a young age, you found what you wanted to do, and you have stuck to that.
Well, I would say I found what I couldn't be without.
Okay.
Let's say that. I found what I could not be without.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's nicely put. So you were taking special interest in writing and poetry. I'm assuming, did you pursue teachers that had that ability and that background?
No, I mean, we're talking middle school.
Yeah.
Everyone has to write middle school, right? You have to do your 5-paragraph essays and book reports and all that stuff. I always took particular interests in having to write poems. I would also try to be as creative with the language as I could, or when I was allowed to. There's not really much pursuance with it, but if there was a thing that began to bring that to the fore, I would say it was the advent of hip hop. Once rap started to come in, right? And you would hear rappers talk about pitting lyrics. It was like, oh yeah, so this is a way that I can actually use poetry and actually write it and perform it and also get some sort of cred. I really started to dig into that.
Got it.
And Poe has a lot to do with that, because you listen to the rhythms again of the Raven. As we say today, Poe had bars when it came down to dropping serious rhythmic, language and stuff. Some of his contemporaries, poets, did not necessarily appreciate that, but he was really quite good at that. And so that sense of internal rhyme and meter, really affected me. And so when hip hop came along, I was sort of primed to listen deeply to a story told in rhyme and rhythm.
Okay. So is this the first time music has entered your life, or did you have music around the house?
My parents grew up on Motown.
Yeah.
So Motown was always around, something being played. I believe I was probably conceived to Smokey Robinson and the Miracle Zoo, Baby Baby. And I'm firmly convinced that my brother was probably conceived to some recording of Al Green. I'm pretty sure about that. By the looks my parents gave each other when certain songs came on, it was like, oh, okay, this has special memory, doesn't it? But music was there.
Yeah.
My mother didn't really listen to church music because she was a Jehovah's Witness, but my father listened to Mahalia Jackson and other gospel singers, and of course, being in where I was, it was a lot of African Americans, so music was always. There were many churches, so it was music always, and you couldn't walk into a place without hearing something. And then, of course, in Mississippi, there are the juke joints, and music is around. So no, music was ubiquitous, when I was growing up.
Great.
Yeah.
Was rap something that you wanted to pursue?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you?
Well, I didn't try it professionally in that sense. I still drop some right now, here and there in some of the stuff that I write, but I loved it. And I used to get into rap battles with people and would go across the city, you know what I'm saying, to engage somebody else in a rap battle.
So you did some performance.
I did some performance, and a lot of it was street. So you could start rapping and people would start gathering around and whatnot. And folks would declare who the winner was. I was doing it, of course, when I got into high school, was also doing that. Loved the performance and the immediate feedback that was getting. You say something that's particularly clever, right? It's like, bam, folks are giving you a lot of love and a lot of dap, right there. There's also a place that those of us who weren't particularly adept at musical instruments could find a way to also participate musically. And it was also happening at the time that a lot of money was being taken away from music programs in schools. And so folks do what folks do. You find a way to make a way out of no way. And so language became the music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we're in high school at this point.
Yeah.
It sounds like you've done a lot of studying on your own.
Yeah.
Was there any particular person in your life who you really truly looked up to as a poet or as a rap performer that was really you were learning from, that somebody was teaching you?
Yeah, absolutely not.
No.
There wasn't anyone who was doing that. Of course, when we talk about hip hop, all of the teachers at this time were considerably older than me, and rap was not their music. And rap was basically coming to us through recordings and the radio.
Yep.
And so it was a new genre. So there was really nobody teaching. It was basically you heard someone with skills. You might do your best to try to emulate what they do and maybe go them one better. You would try to create your own style. One of the beautiful things is that so many albums that you would buy, they would create DJ versions of it because, DJs would want to mix the albums. And so what that meant is that on the other side of those albums was just the instrumental. And so if you got just the instrumental, you could actually practice your flow.
Excellent.
Right?
Yeah.
To this. And so that was also teaching song structure as well. Hey, this is how I do these 16 bars, and then I have to come in with a 4-bar phrase and then go back to another 16 bars or however it was, and then understand when you had to allow the music to do its thing and then come back in. So it was teaching you phrasing, it was teaching you timing,
Yep.
it was teaching you song structure, and also breath control. All of these things were because you had to just sit with an album and figure out how to flow with it, right? How to make it happen. And also if you had written a rhyme, you would figure how to adjust it to the album. So sometimes you could do that on the fly, right? And you might realize, I've got too many syllables in this line for this song, or I have too few syllables in this line. And so that would teach you, you would have to pause and then figure out when to come back in so that you could catch the beat. So it was a lot that was learned just listening to the music, engaging with the music. But no, at that time, there was no Berklee College of Music with professors who was teaching hip hop. It wasn't happening. It was a street art.
Was that the only thing you were doing, or were you still writing non-musical poetry?
Oh,
as
definitely.
well?
Definitely. I was writing other poems as well, but rap really took me because it also made sense of the music. But yeah, there was other stuff. There's also emulations. I was emulating Shakespearean sonnets. I was learning how to write sonnets by doing that. Really, really, really into Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her love pieces and stuff like that. And then I started reading other poetry and trying to emulate it. So yeah, it was definitely doing other poems. And of course, had to write poems in school, right? And they weren't having rap. It was like you have to write something in imitation of blah, 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 or what are you getting from this or that? So they were definitely not studying the Sugar Hill Gang and the Pow Pow Boogie and the Big Bang Bang. They were definitely not studying that, or Curtis Blow. They were studying traditional poetics is what was a part of it. So definitely was still writing traditional verse and poetry.
Very good.
Yeah.
You're done with high school at this point, I'm assuming?
Not assume that, because I had to go a 5th year in high school.
Okay.
With that, it was sobering and embarrassing, and it's just because I just did not do the work and want to skip school and want to hang out with friends and had girlfriends and all of that stuff, and I just didn't do the work, and I had to work my ass off to graduate high school, and I graduated a year later than I should have out of summer school. So it was a lot of work I had to make up for, and a lot of stuff I had to sort of go back over and relearn. And I had to wind up putting myself through summer school because I didn't want my parents to hold that over me. My mother kept, wanting me to drop out and just go get a job, right? She doesn't think I'm going to do it. And I just doubled down and says to hell with that. And I remember this when I graduated. My mother came to my graduation. When I was there, my mom, she wanted to buy me 2 suits. My mother, her thing was to always buy you clothing. I would not accept a suit from her because she didn't believe I could do it. She wanted to go to my graduation. I told her she can do it. She wanted to drive me. I took myself on the bus. And so she was there and she was like, well, let me take you home. And I wasn't about to. And my aunt says, let your mom take you home. So I says, all right, cool. So I did that on my own. I made the way. I'm the one who did it in the face of pushback. Now, what I didn't know at the time was that my mother and father were having problems and my mom wanted to leave, right? And she didn't feel that she could leave if I could not fend for myself, right? And so she was trying to get me to the space of self-sustaining so that she could decide to make that move away from my dad. So I look back on that once we had spoke. I'm like, okay, I get that. Of course, she couldn't tell me that, or she didn't wish to tell me that, but that's how things went down. And that's why she was like, get self-sufficient, get self-sufficient, I don't want you to be basically like my brother, my Uncle Larry, who gave me the dictionary. I don't want you to be like him and just on my couch and blah, blah, blah. So she pushed us in that space of self-sufficiency.
Even if it meant dropping out of school.
Even if it meant that. Yeah. Even if it meant that, like, just go get a job.
Did you feel a sense of growing up on that 5th year? Were you taking life a little more seriously?
Well, I certainly did take it more serious because I wanted to get the hell out of high school. I was doing it on my own, so I had to refocus.
Yeah.
You know, and began to say, okay, I got to hit these books, can't hang out, you know, like I was doing before, and was getting up and doing the studying and making it happen.
Did you still have dreams of college at that point?
No, I did not. My thought was, again, still being in the space of being a Jehovah's Witness. You didn't go to college. They did not push that. That did not materialize. You know, later on, I look back on it now and I'm like, yeah, that was messed up. You know, that was messed up. And because all of my kids, I pushed them toward higher education.
Sure.
Right. And my youngest right now is in college. He's in his 2nd year at this moment at Northeastern. But once I left home, I decided, okay, take a few classes and see what's up, you know, and so I did. But also at that time I was working, and it was like, how does one go about sustaining himself and go to college? And you have to do this. So do I have to move back in with I'm like, the hell with that. So I opted to just work more, you know, and study. I put myself on a regimen, which I didn't realize that there was something called interdisciplinary studies. I called it intellectual cross-training. So I went, and eventually this is how my education began to happen. I went back to a book that I had gotten that I did not read. It was called They Came Before Columbus by a guy named Ivan Van Sertima. And this was after the death of my father, and I began to realize, I don't have many books around the house. I found this book and began reading through it, and it was just so far sort of beyond my intellectual capacity to understand it at the time, but there were things I was getting from it. And so I was like, I don't know how to educate myself. How do I do this if I'm not going to go back to school? And I was like, the bibliography. And so I says, okay, I'm going to finish this book if it kills me, and then I'm going to go to the bibliography and see what looks interesting. So I went in the back, went to the bibliography, and found, I'm like, I don't know much about anthropology. This talks about mythology. Let me find out more about that. And then I had to go to the library and actually get books on those subjects. And what wound up happening is I did the same thing to those books I had done with the first book. And, okay, this is about mythology. Oh, I don't know much about the ancient Greeks or about blah, blah, blah. So I went and I got those books and I began to, and the library began to grow and to grow and to grow, which is still, it's upstairs, it's crazy. It was grassroots education of myself. And there's that Mr. Green coming back, you know, that you got to get interested.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
And that even though I was traditionally unmatriculated, traditionally uneducated, I didn't have to stay that way.
Yeah.
Right. And so even if I was not going to, quote unquote, go to college for undergrad, that did not mean that I had to remain ignorant about the world.
Right.
And so that was basically how I became an autodidact, you know, on my own.
I don't know what that means.
Okay. Self-taught.
Okay. Well, and that's actually going to feed nicely into my next question.
Sure.
Did you ever think of asking for help?
No, that never occurred to me to do that at all. Guidance for me in this sense, I don't believe happened for me until I met Kent Foreman, who took an interest in me, became my mentor when I was mid-20s. And he was a guy, was going to a place called Spices. And Spices was a jazz joint that did poetry, open mic on a Monday night. And I would go there and my mind just got lit up with doing poems. Oh, and I would come back every week with something. And Kent was an older man. He came to me and he just said, you know, one day, young man, you might be a hell of a poet if you don't drink yourself to death. And I look over it, I'm like, who the hell are you? You know, I could tell you all the things that was going through my head. But anyway, he just kept coming back. I'm like, what is with this old cat? keep coming back, to me, and he offers me a book, and I'm like, okay. And we began to develop a friendship. And he was the first person, besides my uncle giving me a book and stuff like that, and of course teachers who were guiding me along the way, who said you may have something. But he was the first person who I can remember that took this genuine interest in saying, let's talk about life. Let's talk about poetry. Let's really look at what does it mean to be three things: Black, male, and poet. How do those three identities hook up with each other? What does that mean to be each of those, and how do they find themselves expressed in you? And him and I, we became, again, deep friends. I always knew my father loved me, but this was sort of a father who got me. You know what I'm saying? This dude understood me. And so he was the first person who I would say took a genuine interest.
So do you think he saw the talent in you? I'm going to try to find somebody.
In talking to Kent, he said for himself, he always felt that it was his responsibility to mentor anyone who he could, but most especially young Black men.
So you weren't alone on his list of folks he was mentoring at the time?
No.
Okay.
I would say mostly. Later on, people got to know him. He seemed to have taken a special interest in me, and later on, there were folks who are now also friends of mine.
Do you think it was your talent, or was it your personality that he was attracted to in that sense of this is
I think it was probably
a special
both.
project that I want to take?
I think it was probably both.
Okay.
He felt I had skill, and I was unafraid of a crowd. I was very performative in what I was doing. I would come off the stage and get in people's face and stuff like that. And he was also, in the 60s and 70s, he was also an actor. He had also worked with jazz musicians like Abbey Lincoln. He had worked with her. He had also worked with Max Roach and had written some songs and some lyrics. So he was also very much into the theater and all of that. I think he saw that wild fire, theatrical, go get 'em kind of thing in me, and it reminded him of himself. And so he reached out to me, and I'm surprised he kept coming back, but he did. So I think both. I think it was the talent, what he saw as talent, what he saw as guts, but also maybe what he saw as vulnerability as well. And I think all three of those, probably attracted him to say, yeah, let me go and see what's really up with this young man, blah, blah, blah. So whatever that was, I'll never have the chance to ask him. He died some years ago. His daughter and I were still pretty close. Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So what is it that you feel you learned from him? What was he teaching you? Was he introducing you to new artists that you had never met before? Was he sitting down and talking about poetry structure and things like that?
Several things. He was an avid reader. We talked about history. He was very much into history, especially he really also talked about the history of what happened with human beings post-war. And he was also into science fiction, but especially racial science fiction. He loved Octavia Butler. And we would talk about the ideas of that. He was also had been involved in the major part of the civil rights struggle, that there is a responsibility to art. We should answer that. He would say that we should have an artistic Hippocratic oath that says, first, do no harm. He gave me a deeper interest in philosophy. He loved philosophy, and so he introduced me to philosophers and questions that they were asking. He introduced me to jazz albums that later became staples for me. I had never listened to Kind of Blue before he and I listened to it. I had never listened to A Love Supreme before he and I listened to it. I didn't know who Max Roach was, but because he had worked with Max Roach, I was like, wow, listening to some of the stuff with Max Roach. So he really gave me a deep appreciation for jazz and also for bourbon. Him and I, we used to sit up and we used to drink Blanton's. That was the bourbon that he liked to drink. Now it's hardly affordable. I brought him here to Massachusetts when I first moved here, and we began to travel through Massachusetts doing poems. And him and I would have this sort of older man, younger man thing of poems that sort of echo each other. And so we worked together as poets. So we formed a deep, lasting, abiding trust and a friendship. But I learned a lot from him. And one of the things he would always say, his thing is, trust your ear, right? Trust your ear. And he's like, your eyes might tell you something works. He's like, but you need to hear it. Trust your ear. And I think because of him And I think back to my great-grandfather, the musicality of the language is pinnacle in many ways.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Lotsofmaps.com. Vintage, local, national, and world maps for an affordable price. 99% of our maps are $25 or less. Great as gifts. Frame them or put them under glass for your home, vacation home, or as a memory of a special place. Lotsofmaps.com.
So performing
Mm-hmm.
is your main outlet at this point. Had you been published at this point yet? And was that something that you were seriously, was important to you?
Yes. Well, kind of. I published a book a long time ago and some chapbooks. I'm looking to publish probably more so now because more people are asking me about that.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole literary thing as far as submissions and blah, 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 and all that stuff, it just never held much attraction for me. I was much more of the write it and then get out there and do it, So, but it's not like I don't, I do have published works, right? I do, people have published stuff, but so much more of my stuff is for performance. Yeah, more performative than anything else, I would say. But yes, there are some things which are published.
Great. When were you first published? How old were you at that point?
I think it was called The Reader, and that was a Chicago magazine, newspaper, and that was early mid-20s.
Had you sought them out? Or
No, they sought me out. It was somebody who had heard me do something and asked me if they could publish that piece, and I said, absolutely. So
that must have felt good.
yeah, I gave it to them, and then they asked me to write something of an article of like 10 books that I would take with me on a desert island. So I wrote the 10 books in haiku. So something about this is what I think about this book and blah, 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 blah. And so they published that. So that what I would say is probably my first newspaper article to actually get published.
Performance was still your number one thing. Like you said, that feedback, that instant feedback.
Yeah.
Looking at people's faces and...
Yeah. You know what? It also goes back to the beginnings of what this is about. I mean, our tenure on this planet has primarily been oral, performative. Let's just be truthful. That is the major thing, I think, that made us human, right? Sitting around the fire, telling each other stories, doing poems and performance for one another, putting in symbol and ritual what happened during the day, right? We're talking 200,000 years before we began to write stuff down,
You don't look that old, I got to be honest.
Well, thank you. I moisturize, not Zima. But no, it's like our species is, 200,000 years before we started putting this stuff on paper.
Yeah.
And in stone and on cuneiform.
I guess I look at it as, okay, well, publishing is a way to reach further out, reaching potentially more people versus those that have to seek you out and come hear you perform.
I suppose so, yeah.
I was just wondering if popularity was important to you or not. Was it more just I'm focused on the local?
I never really thought about it, when it came to that. I think it just happened that people liked what I did and had to say, and it just grew in that sense. The idea of notoriety and all of that stuff, it never really meant much, in that sense. It just kind of happened. Yeah. And so there are points of notoriety that I do enjoy because for me, it says that what I'm doing is of value to people. And I do like being of value. The getting it out there so more people might read and know my name, it just never really seemed that important to me.
Very good. I like that. So you spent at least 10 years, if not more, with Kent on the road and such. You obviously learned a lot from him.
Yes.
Was there anyone else or any other experiences that even taught you more, that brought you further into your education?
Yes. My education continued. I went when I got an MFA, Master of Fine Arts in Poetry. That was at New England College, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. I got my MFA at 38. There were younger folks who were in the program who had just graduated from college, so it was 22 to 24-year-olds. But you also had people who were retiring professors, though they may have had 1 or 2 master's degrees, that they had always wanted to go and finish that book and learn how to write better. And so they had come back. So there was this great mixture of this young energy from folks in the program and also this older wisdom from folks in the program because it was designed for as a low residency program. I would go 10 days a semester and it would be really intense. And then we'd work with mentors, different mentors on packages of poems and essays and all of this stuff and having good connection with mentors. And it was the first time that I think, since of course, when I was younger, that I had somebody who was really interested in my work, were willing to give me the feedback to sort of make the work better and to make the work pop. So that was great. And then there was the diving into all of the essays that were strictly about poetry and thoughts on poetry and discussing 24 hours a day, this is what we're about, on this, and meeting other poets and meeting essayists and folks who were coming from other places in poetry that I didn't even know existed. And it was a wonderful, for me, a very, very, very great time of learning and growth. And so many things about it that I miss, that I wish, which would continue. And I do that. I have friends who I work with and we do stuff together, but that was a real great time getting introduced to all those wonderful ideas about poetry that I didn't know were existent at all.
Do you feel like there's more for you to learn at this point?
Oh man, plenty. I mean, and to relearn, because,
sure.
You gather certain factoids and facts and stuff and you incorporate some of it into your life and your writing and you don't really know where it goes after that. But then to like rediscover, a book and you're like, oh, wow, I forgot how much I actually learned from this and how much it's actually reopening, my thoughts to ideas that I had sort of, not necessarily say put to rest, but sort of forgotten about, especially, when one has to be in the pursuits of keeping, the wolf away from the door and all that other stuff and raising a family. But yeah, just rediscovering some of the beauty of language. And every time I rediscover like Wisława Szymborska, who's Polish Nobel Prize winning poet, absolutely wonderful work, or the works of Pablo Neruda, rediscovering those who I've been looking into lately, digging back into the works of Whitman, who is our first sort of poet of American democracy, and the way the country was for him at that time, how he saw the country, what he thought about democracy, what he thought about what he would call the love of comrades, and asking a relatively young country to look at itself, and what it envision what it could be. And also at the same time, what Emily Dickinson was giving to us, as much as he was sounding his barbaric yawp across the world's rooftops, she was in her room constructing these tiny gems of poems that were about exploring the internal space, as much as Whitman was about the polis and seeing those two tensions and rediscovering those tensions. Beautiful. And rediscovering the works of Langston Hughes in a way that I'd never really had seen before. Recently, I had to do something called the 100-Year Book Debate. And in the 100-Year Book Debate, what happens is in this, the organizers go back, get books that were 100 years old and have scholars argue about them now. And I went and had to go back and read Langston Hughes' first book of poems, The Weary Blues. And I had never read The Weary Blues. I had read most of the poems in The Weary Blues in selected works of Hughes and collected works, but they're put differently. Juxtaposed sometimes differently, but to actually experience the work the way Hughes wanted it to be experienced and to look at the range of that he works in that. Now, he was only like 26 or 27 years old when he did that. And I was like, wow, and I was never really a Langston Hughes fan, right? He was always one of the most, as far as his poetry, he was always one of the most important people that I thought in American letters, but I never really vibed. I liked his stories and his essays. But with this book, I really became like a Hughes poetry fan of this book, The Weary Blues, and what he gave. So again, I studied him in school, but I didn't connect in that way that I do now. So the learning continues and the relearning continues.
Very good.
Yeah.
So after you got your MFA, or even while you were getting your MFA, how often were you performing at that time?
I was performing a fair amount, I would say, when I was getting my MFA, because that was primarily the way that I made money, right? And I had made money and was able to feed my family previous to that, so that did not stop. And so I would be able to go overseas sometimes in the summer. I was still doing a lot of stuff in Massachusetts. And I was also working with schools. I would come into schools a lot and do performance and poetry. And so I was, yeah, still doing a lot of performance even while I was studying. There would be sometimes I'd have to get packages of my poems and stuff to my teachers and I have to send it in to them from someplace else where I was. Because at that time, folks wanted like actual packets. It wasn't Google Doc. It was not really a thing at the time where you could just drop it in.
Right.
So it was like people wanted to actually receive the packages and then send them back to you marked up. And then you would talk with them on the phone. So yeah, the Zoom and all of this stuff was not a thing. Was not a thing.
Yeah. So at what point were you starting to feel the teaching bug?
I think I've always felt it to a degree because I've always done like workshops, right? But I really wanted to dive more into pedagogy after the MFA. I also felt that I had learned a lot more and about how poems work and actually diving into them and felt I had something to maybe teach younger folks who did not know how to do that. And so I started working with Grub Street, which is, I'm on the board now. And Grub Street has a program called YAWP, Young Adult Writers Program, which I was very involved with for many years. And I would teach young folks through the summer and actually longer. Yeah, I would teach them through the summer and also sometimes through the year, having to create syllabi and having to create curriculum and planning and all of that. That was also part of it. Then I also began teaching simultaneously with doing that. I was teaching also at Emerson's summer program. It was a pre-college program in which students were coming from all over the world, literally, for this program. And so I started teaching international students as well.
Wow.
And then Berklee College of Music asked me to teach during the summers as well. And so there were musicians who wanted to come into Berklee, but also who wanted to brush up on songwriting and stuff like that. So at one point in time, I was teaching at Grub Street, Emerson, and Berklee, and sometimes on the same day. Sometimes on the same day.
Wow.
And so that went on for maybe 5 years. And then I was like, okay, I don't know if I can sustain that. So now I no longer teach at Grub Street, but I am on the board. I do teach at Berklee now as a professor, an assistant professor at Berklee. I will do performances at Emerson, but I no longer teach with Emerson. And also, again, as you know, teach at Clark University in Worcester. So the teaching bugs continued. And there is a part of me, though, that though I love teaching, there's a part of me now which is just sort of wondering if I can do more at the university besides teaching. I think the sort of eclectic way that I've educated myself into multiple subjects and to be able to write in multiple subjects about different things, there are parts of me that figure I could probably also help augment curriculum for other teachers to sort of be a sort of lecturer person moving through the colleges and, hey, let's talk about poetry and science. Or, whoa, let's talk about ekphrastic art. Hey, let's talk about, how is there some connection between how we construct a poem and how you might construct a building? Let's look at this. So there's been more and more of me saying, maybe I want to think about how to bring this to more people than the 16 to 25 students who I have in my classes,
Are you teaching different things at the different schools?
Yes, but there's some overlap. Okay. There is, for instance, at Clark, I'm presently teaching a straight poetry class, straight poetry. And then there's times when I teach something called voicing the verse. It's public speaking, but it's about writing things and using poetry as a way to construct texts that may or may not be poems, but construct text that you can deliver and speak. So some of them might be pitching a business plan, and we might write about that, or making a commercial, or if you're going into school, how do you go about creating, text for students, so that you can show them. So that uses poetry as a basis. At Clark, there is a slam poetry class, which is direct performance poetry. And it is writing for performance, right? And it's typically writing 3-minute pieces that really move a crowd. And then there's the class I teach there called Poetry and Lyric, Studies in Poetry and Lyric, in which we do poetry, straight poetry, but we also go into song lyrics and talk about the prosaic structures that are happening in both this poem and that song. So I might make a comparison between a sonnet, let's just say a Shakespearean sonnet, and what's happening with a hot 16, which is a basic unit in hip hop. And so how do they speak to each other? What's going on here? Well, they both have approximately the same amount of lines. And what are they trying to do? They're both using music. They're both using rhyme and they both have a structure, and let's compare these structures to each other. So those are the four things I mainly teach. I've been asked to teach more if I wanted to, and have been offered the chance at both places to make up classes that I might want to teach. And I've thought about it. But the more I take on teaching, also the less I can really perform. And I've been noticing, unfortunately, there are times when I have to tell my students that we have to conduct this on Zoom because I have to go do something, or we're not having class this week, so I want you guys to read this and send me what you think about it, and I'll respond to you from the road. So I don't want to continue to do that, to call off class because of performance. But both colleges have been very, very supportive. Berklee actually likes it. They're kind of okay if you're a professor who has to go and do gigs. That's kind of a feather for them. They're like, yeah, because it opens up opportunities for students, and it becomes also a way of networking, right? So especially if I'm doing something and I'm like wanting to use students for it, they absolutely love it because it's students getting an education in how to do this.
And you're still driven by your own works and interested to be on a stage. So I can see where, especially Berklee, would love that. Because you're not just someone who's talking about their past, they're talking about their now and their future too.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. I like that.
Yeah.
So how did the idea of you becoming Poet Laureate appear?
Well, I would say it wasn't about me becoming the Poet Laureate, but last year, our governor decided to create the post of a Poet Laureate. It had been pushed for about 20 years by two legislators. It was not going anywhere in the legislature. I have my thoughts about why that may be the case, but our governor looked around and someone came to her, I believe it was Michael Bobbitt or someone who was with the Mass Cultural Council, and says, why don't we have a Poet Laureate? What's the deal? And according to Governor Healy, she said, we don't. Why don't we have a Poet Laureate? And then she found out the history of it trying to get pushed. And she says, okay, we're going to create one. And by governor's decree, we're going to create the post. We're going to push it. We're going to see if we can get some money for it because we need one. And I think her thought was, especially at this time, we need to bring people back to the power of words. And so I was there along with, probably 100 of my closest poet friends in the governor's office when she created this post. And so we were like, yes, right? And the process would be that the Mass Cultural Council would be sending out applications. Feel free to apply. And people had said, you're going to apply, right? And I went, maybe. And they said, no, you should apply. I'm like, okay. And so more and more folks kept saying, you should apply. And I was sort of, maybe. And then a poet said, it is your duty. She said this for herself too. She's like, if you're being asked to serve, I think of it as that we should. And she was the one who really sort of made me go, okay, sure.
You did say earlier that you have a responsibility.
Yes. I had heard that, but it didn't really hit me about what the responsibility, what it meant, until I was actually in my breakfast nook and I was filling out the application. And in filling out the application, I kept noticing I kept using words like honor, and it would be an honor, and it would be an honor. But I was like, wait a minute, that's not the right word. And I'm like, the right word is this is a responsibility. This is a trust. This is going to take time. And it was at that point, Andy, where I knew I could not do this by myself. I had to go and speak to my partner, my wife. And I thought about, because if I was running for office or something, right, I'm taking on this charge. And it's like, I can't just do this. I can't just be selfish and do it. I walked away from the application and I talked to Katie. I said, look, we need to talk. And I explained to her what this would probably mean and that I'm going to have to do a lot of traveling and I'm going to have to be thinking with stuff. And there's going to be folks in our home and we're going to have to talk to about poetry and I'm going to have to do this. And she was like, okay. And I'm saying, I need to know that you're good with this. And she thought about it. And it took us a couple of days. And she's like, yeah, I agree with your friend. If you're asked to serve, you need to do it. She was like, you absolutely have to do this if you are called. She says, you fill out the application. At least do that. I says, all right, cool. And so I filled out the application, sent it in, and says, hey, all right. 2 weeks before the names were announced, I got a call from the governor's office telling me, actually from the Mass Cultural Council, saying, you are one of two.
Oh.
It was 125 people who had applied, and he said, you are one of two. And now we begin the background checks. Okay? I says, okay, cool. And then on May, and that was then 2 weeks later, on May 29th, I get the call from the governor's office. We would like to congratulate you on being named Massachusetts
Wow.
first Poet Laureate, right? And I was like, ooh, okay, Now, and so it begins, right? And so that's what it was. And that was one day before they made the announcement. And I was preparing for a huge performance of something. And I had musicians that were in the rehearsal rooms. And I had to be like, I need to go away, accept this award, and come back, And so I went to the PBS Museum here in Salem and accepted the award, talked to people and did a poem and met folks and then thanked everybody and stayed to the end and then went back to rehearsal, and was there till like midnight.
Wow.
It was a hell of a ride.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
During the background checks, did they ever discover that you ripped pages out of a book?
They had never found that out. Although I did not cop to ripping the page out the book. But the regular library branch, which is the place I had stolen some books from them before.
Boy. Okay.
And I never returned them.
Oh.
And they brought me back years later to do something for children. And it was at that point that I said, look, I took some books some years ago and I never brought them back. And I'd like to pay you for them. They says, consider it a gift. It's okay. So I got absolved from
The $10,000 worth
fine
of
that I probably would have had to pay. Yeah, seriously. I would imagine the book fine on that one. It would have been enormous. But they was like, I think we can forgive this.
Very
so I'm
nice.
like, all right, cool.
Yeah. I got to ask, how does it feel? I mean, I know the answer is going to be, outstanding, but to be picked out of 125 people that are specialists in their work, to be chosen as the first. I mean, that.
Yeah.
Well, and again, I know you said honor, but it must be, I would assume.
It is an honor. It feels great to have that kind of trust and to feel as though I am representing my state, my governor, my family, and poetry well. But there's a deeper feeling to that. The understanding that Black people in this country were not allowed to read at one point. It was illegal to teach us how to read. And my great-grandfather was illiterate, as I've said. And now for his great-grandson, a descendant of African enslaved individuals who were not taught to read on pain of death, is now the first poet laureate of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Massachusetts being the first state to legalize slavery and the first to give it up.
Yeah.
An African American is the poet laureate of the state. I don't have words for that feeling. Yeah. There is an ancestral connection, and there is a purgation that I have not yet been able to grapple with. To know that happened here, there's a healing, I think, of a rip and a rift that I don't know if I'll be able to even really speak about it until years after my tenure.
You're holding two different titles. What's your day-to-day like? First of all, juggling three different things can't be an easy thing. Plus, you've got a family.
Yeah.
So what is your day-to-day like juggling? And then as a poet laureate, what are your day-to-day responsibilities?
Much of those are things I have to schedule. I'm either speaking with someone about education, getting the bookings, one wants to say, or whatever the events that I have to go and attend to. The governor's office will sometimes send me, when there are requests. So I have to look at those and get back to the governor's office about which one of those that I'm able to take. There is a constant writing of texts for different events, probably always 3 of those that I have to write. And if there's not writing, there is editing. There's also occasionally I wind up getting letters from people and I respond to those. There again is often 3 meetings or more per day that have to deal with sometimes variously different things that are related to poetry. Fielding questions for my students, I still have to take care of that. When my schools have meetings, of course, I have to be there for that, giving my students feedback on their work. I have to keep office hours at my colleges, but I prefer not to do them at the college because if I do them at the college, I have to go into the college, number one. But then my contract only stipulates 2 hours for office hours, and my students need more time than that. And some of my students work. So I open it to them to contact me to do it by Zoom. And that way, it means I'm doing more office hours that I'm contracted to do. But my students are getting much more individualized, attention, and they can contact me at a time that's convenient for them. So every day, some combination of all of that is happening. Okay. And of course, my wife and kids and, having to check in and seeing how they do. So the personal life is always there too.
Sure. I hate to do this to you, but I want to ask you about money.
Sure.
I don't think of poetry as a big moneymaker.
Right.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
As a young person in your 20s, let's say, were you making money
in my 20s?
Performing?
I would say no. I had other jobs. I had gone to automotive school. I was working.
Right.
I had started to also work for an armored car company and learn how to shoot. Well, I already knew how to shoot, but so I did have jobs.
Yep.
And then I would go and perform.
Yep.
It's just like most of the folks who I had known before. Performance was something they did when they weren't making money on the job, right? It was always extra money, but it was what they really loved to do. Right. And so most of us, we would always say, my job is paying for my art career. So so that's how that was.
And I'm not trying to state that money is an important thing. I just didn't know whether there was any opportunity to be paid to perform.
Yes.
And at what point in your career was that starting to happen? Were you established at that point, I would imagine?
It started to really happen more and more for me after I was part of a movie called Love Jones, and it was a movie that was based loosely on my life. And the movie became popular, and as a result, people started calling and finding me more and more and more. And so after a while, I was able to walk away from the 9-to-5 job and be able to apply myself more into performance. Now, the way that I've also kept myself is that we've been talking poetry a lot, right? But what I really call myself is a literary performer. And that is a person who tries to find the right words, place them in the right order to deliver them the right way to get the right kind of effect. And so I have several C's that I work in. I call them my several C's. And that is classrooms. I would look at those as like K through high school, colleges, community, based work, community centers, convivals, which are things we might call parties, right? And so about entertainment in that sense. And I work with churches and faith organizations as well. And I work with scientists with climate change. I was doing a lot of stuff around language, around climate change. And so just trying to make it as a quote unquote poet, right? That's a very difficult thing. For me, it was about how to use what poetry gives to serve other interests. So what can poetry do besides be a pretty thing people hear? Right? We can use ideas of prosody and tools of prosody to actually help with the construction of other texts as well. Part of what poetry is someone speaking or something you're reading in such a way that makes you lean in. Something happened that made you lean in, right? What was that? Well, that was the poetic moment. That was the moment that says, I want to connect. And so creating texts that are about connection. And I do that. And folks, of course, they seek me out to do larger stuff. I've worked with Handel Haydn, who've paid me for text. I've worked with them for years. I'm going to be doing something with the BSO, doing something with them.
Right.
I've worked with singers, and people have sought me out to create lyrics, for their work, or to help them with the lyrics of their songs. So I work with that. I work with musicians all the time. Then, of course, there's always the lecturing. Schools tend to call me in to do workshops at their schools, and also professional development workshops for teachers. I have a group called Arts for Social Cohesion, which is about how do we take the best of what's happening in arts pedagogy and use it to bring communities closer together. And so we use art to do that. So it's all these other sort of tributaries, right, that also contribute as far as, Regie Gibson making a living. And of course, there was a small stipend, that goes on. And of course, now, being Poet Laureate, more and more people want to bring you out and talk to you. And I try to keep things affordable, especially when it's something to do with the state. I really try to keep it affordable. So I try to work within people's budgets.
Yep.
The interesting thing for me is that during COVID, I was one of the few artists I know one of the few poets who actually made money. There was parts of my income that increased.
Wow.
As a result of that. And that was because people could contact me. I could write text and we could do stuff online. And I was working with faith organizations, and I could only do one per Sunday. And I was creating workshops like poetry as a spiritual practice. And I could only do one per Sunday, maybe two if I could get to another church or a synagogue. But because of COVID, I could do 3 or 4 per day.
Yeah.
Right?
No more face-to-face.
Yeah. No, it was
good.
no more face-to-face, but I could work with congregations.
Yeah.
And so I was working with congregations in California.
Great.
Which I never could have done before. I worked with organizations also in Ireland, which I never would have done before. I began to work with the World Bank. And so during COVID, because of my various and sundry interests in how to use language as a way to bring connection and to explore, I was uniquely suited to be able to take advantage of that opportunity when it showed up. Terrible time in many ways, and a good time in other ways.
Very good.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about advice that you might have for folks that might want to follow in your footsteps or become a writer or a poet. We just talked about money. So your advice is, if you want to make big money, become a poet. Is that what you're saying?
Not quite. What I want to say is, if you want to make money, you need to be of use. Okay? And people need to see something that they get as a value in what it is that you offer. Beware of too much navel gazing, right? Looking only at yourself, if that's what you want to do. Sometimes I like to say this, what we poets do, we gaze at our navels and then discuss the quality of the lint. For me, it's about being outwardly focused, right? How do we make work that connects? I would say, think about what actually brings people to art and connection and music and poetry and writing in the first place. And not that it's just about having fun. There are 5 things to think about, at least 5, I would say. One is, does the work engage? Does it get attention? Does it entertain? Does it keep attention? Does it affect? Which means, does it cause someone to rethink, maybe act, or consider doing something? Does it educate? Does an individual know something more about a subject than before they saw you? And in the end, does it elevate? Does it somehow make us want to be better and bring us into a space where we weren't before? If you can do 3 of those, you're creating value. But you have to think about all 5.
Right.
And think about, how do you move your work toward that? And very often that means that there's a much more of a focus on your audience than there is necessarily on you.
Right.
People do not want to pay for anybody else's self-portrait. I know I don't. The only self-portrait I ever bought was from Frida Kahlo.
Ooh.
That's the only thing I own. But think about it. If someone comes to you and it's like, here's my self-portrait, would you like it? You're probably going to say no.
Good point.
But if they make a portrait of you, well, now that's something that a person will be like, oh, I didn't know I could be seen this way. Now they have interest in what it is you're doing. So it's about, what are you giving to an individual so that they receive it and they're like, wow, there's something happening in me. Because The difference between the demagogue says, this is what I can do.
Mm.
I believe that the artist needs to say, this is what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And folk walking away with that sense of, yeah, okay, I can be better at doing this human thing. How do you take that hurt and that pain and turn it into hustle and turn it into flower, right? Yes, we're going to get shit, but almost everything that is edifying grows from it. Understand that. Take that and turn it into something for someone else. And for me, the way to do that has always been mouth to ear.
So, first of all, I was going to try to sell you my self-portrait, but now I won't do that.
Make a poem out of it.
Second
This
of
guy
all,
sold me his
it's
self-portrait.
surprising that you wouldn't want to like have a picture of me staring you.
Isn't it, though?
That is very
Isn't it?
unusual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet.
Second of all, your way of learning was a lot of self-learning, self-teaching.
Yeah.
Would you recommend that to somebody? No, you didn't do it the traditional way that teachers want you to do it, and you've been taught by blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Is it possible that that's what made you different or makes you different?
Possibly, yeah.
So I know it's a difficult thing to really kind of capture, but there must be a side of you that says that you as a student, not you, but the people that are listening who might be interested in this, you need to find yourself on your own to some degree, but don't be afraid to ask help too. Is that good advice?
I would definitely say that. I mean, look, one of the things about us human beings is that we teach each other. That's how we pass on history. You know, that's how we pass on skills, right? Of course. I forgot that saying, who made it, the saying, but it was the idea that there are two educations you get in your life. One is given to you by other people. The other is the one that you teach yourself. And I think we can get both. I would tell people, don't think that education stops at school. How do I know I'm educated? Well, someone gave me a sheepskin. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? Is that education or is that a scholastic academic form of training? The goal of education is to teach you how to educate yourself, is to teach you how to become a lifelong learner, how to become a person who can take the skills that you've garnered from being at schools and apply that for the rest of your life so that you can still keep on taking in information, right? Many of us do believe that after we walk down the aisle and throw up the mortarboard, that's the journey. Nah, man. You just basically been given a toolbox. Now go build something.
Yeah.
We must continue to educate ourselves. And not only that, but neurologically. It's just better if you do. Yeah. It's better if you continue to engage with language, if you continue to engage with ideas, if you continue to engage with art, if you continue to keep bringing in information and being present in the world and understanding the past, understanding history, right? Which is important to understand us as human beings and who we were, to see who we are, to know who we can be, right? Go back and get that stuff. And it's just a shame when we don't. We feel that, a loosening of our intellectual grip when we aren't feeding ourselves. We become less adept at understanding concepts and less adept at understanding when people in power are bullshitting us.
Yeah.
So we need to keep that critical thinking fed.
You got to love a challenge too. If you don't love a challenge, then you're not going to be up for teaching yourself anything.
I would say that's absolutely true. Yeah, absolutely true. You can't learn if you don't know that you don't know something.
Right.
And submit yourself to what it means to learn it, right? You can't learn if you're not humble. Yeah.
Well, and like all art, there's no one way to do it.
Nope. But you do have to submit to it.
But you
do have to submit to it. Yeah. You can find your way, but you got to submit to it, right?
And discipline must be a huge part of it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And intake, not just output. This is another thing that I would always also say to poets who are like, some younger poets are like, I don't want to be influenced by anybody. I'm like, you're already influenced. Okay, it's just a question of you picking what's going to influence you. Yep. Okay, you're influenced by TV, by radio, by Spotify, by Siri, by all of this stuff. You need to pick what's going to influence you. That is where education also happens. That's an empowerment. When you say, for the next 30 minutes, Shakespeare has my brain. Okay, you've determined that you're going to do that. That is a form of education. Yep. Yes, find different ways to do stuff and even learn from the mistakes, right? Mistakes is where it really happens, right? Jackson Pollock did what painters had done for thousands or so of years. it said, wait a minute, there's something in this mistake, right? There's something in this.
Yep.
And what happens? Because of what he's doing, we begin to study him in science, fluid dynamics. And it's because of a mistake that he said, well, maybe not. Let's see if I can ride this mistake, right?
That's how things are discovered.
That's how things are discovered. What just happened? I don't know, but let's see if we can ride that and see what goes on with it. So even the mistakes, even the things you get wrong, learn from those things and be grateful when someone corrects you. Look, I never like being corrected, ever. But I love being less wrong. Okay? And that means for me to get to that latter state, I have to deal with that former state. Okay?
Fair enough.
Hate being corrected, but I love being less wrong.
Okay. I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. Reggie, would you be kind enough to read something for us to wind down this interview?
Sure. Something from me or something from someone else?
Something from you would be really great.
This is, I would say, for us humans, these 8 billion folks of us walking around this planet. Here we are in the sea of stars, somewhere between Venus and Mars. Short-lived hominids hanging about, doing our best to figure this out. Where do we come from? Where do we go? What does it mean to question? What does it mean to know? What is this thing we've all deemed as reality? Is it real? Or just an imagined fallacy that we all have invented from our collective human senses? Is this world merely a screen upon which shadows are beamed as they radiate, emanating from a light screamed from behind us? Why does space and time seem to confine us? Is there more to us? Or are we just intelligible dust floating in this vat of galactic blackness? Does anybody really know what the fact is? Is there a being listening to prayer? Or are we alone and there's nothing there? I don't know the math, but I know somehow 1 life plus 2 short equals live your life now. Because here we are in the sea of stars, somewhere between Venus and Mars. Short-lived hominids hanging about, doing our best to figure it out. And there it is.
Regie Gibson, assistant professor at Clark University and at Berklee School of Music, and the first and only, at this point, Poet Laureate of Massachusetts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate it.
For letting us relive your life and learn.
Certainly.
Learn. Thank you for listening. We will have another episode of Occupations coming soon.
Occupations has been brought to you by lotsofmaps.com. Please follow Occupations the Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to find information about our next episode or to see what past episodes are available.